Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and Daniel, it's good to see you.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul.
Very nice. Well, we want to talk a little bit more about the bill that we have visited about before, and that's of course the big Omnibus bill, the atrocious spending of over $1 trillion and 2,000 pages. And it should be to nobody's surprise that things are buried in there that aren't so nice, and we want to talk about one item that we have talked about a little bit in the past too, and that is CISA, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. Sounds very good. They wanted to tighten up on security and protect us. The only problem with this, it's tightening up security. They're worrying about security at the same time. They are destroying privacy and liberty. So that's that old trade-off that they think is necessary, which I obviously think should never occur. But I want to read a short statement that was put on the Wired page, internet service that they have, describing how this thing came about. And then we'll talk a little bit about what this means. But I thought they got it pretty good. And as I read this, it'll probably bring back memories on things that we experienced in Washington, because we knew there was on the surface how Congress was run and how they would have great debates. Then all of a sudden, things would slip into a bill, and should be to nobody's surprise. But this is how they analyze this from Wired. In the late night session of Congress, the House Speaker, Paul Ryan, announced a new version of the Omnibus bill, a massive piece of legislation that deals with much of the federal government's funding. It now includes a version of CISA as well. Lumping CISA in with the Omnibus bill further reduces any chance for debate over the surveillance-friendly provisions or a White House veto. And the latest version actually chips away even further at the remaining personal information protections that privacy advocates had fought for in the version that the Senate passed. Does that bring back any memories on how Washington works?
Yeah, you were talking a little bit earlier about how this works, and I think maybe you could explain it, because I think a lot of people don't understand how these things get snuck in, and it really is very interesting.
I worked on the assumption that everything you hear about in any major debate on the House floor or in committee has no meaning. It's always a distraction, and it can be very robust and on each side. For instance, on this, there was a lot of robust discussion, and the people spoke out, and most of the time it was stopped, or they would have passed it in the open. So they had to have a mechanism. So the Omnibus bill is the mechanism, because everybody's anxious to get it passed. They finally talked the new administration of the House that no shutdown, it's bad politics to shut down the government and cut spending. So we had to get it through, and therefore they go ahead and they stick this on. You say, well, how do they do this? I mean, they passed the bill, how can they take it and stick it on? And they do it in a way that is very sneaky and wrong, and is just the reason why people get so disgusted with Washington. So this is one of the first big act of the new House leadership, and what they have is a process called the Manager's Amendment. The Manager's Amendment means that if you have a bill that goes through the House, and it has to, through committee, it goes to the Rules Committee, and it tells you what the specific rules are on that day for that bill. And let's say that 80% of it is okay, 20% they don't like, and they want to put a bunch of substitutes in for it. Well, they don't have to have a vote for it. They have one single amendment. They call it the Manager's Amendment. It's the chairman of the Rules Committee that can stick it in, and to bring the bill even up. It's totally changed from the original bill, and the Rules Committee it's always said to be a powerful committee. And when you think about it, it could be one of the most powerful, because they have to deal with every piece of legislation, and they bring this up. And of course, how do you become chairman of the Rules Committee? You got to be part of the establishment. You're appointed by the Speaker, and the Speaker, nobody's in leadership that doesn't endorse generally the establishment point of view, Republicans or Democrats, and that's why policies never change, and that's why you see finally, even though they're at loggerheads a lot of times, when push comes to shove, the Republicans and the Democrats, lo and behold, spend this money and stick on the worst thing, more money, more debt for the people, at the same time, less liberty.
I remember it often in the Foreign Affairs Committee. You know, you would have a debate, you would have a hearing in the committee, you would have a markup, you would have a discussion of a bill, and then it happened a lot with Hyde and Lantos. Then they would get together and make their manager's amendment, would change everything else that was agreed in the committee, and then it would go to the floor with a completely changed bill. So it was just no point in the process at all.
And I think your important point there is the ranking member and the chairman, Republican and Democrats, get together because they don't want, they can pretend, but ultimately they're on the same side of these issues, whether it's monetary issues, spending issues. You see, there was no real resistance to the spending. Matter of fact, it was made much worse because they got rid of sequestration. And I'm still very much impressed, amazed. They didn't talk about security. They didn't talk about liberty, and they didn't bring up the subject of increasing the money, for the military. And of course, we have to rebuild the military. We just have, we're only equal to most of the other countries of the world, and we have to rebuild our military. It's all these shenanigans. Fortunately, more Americans are waking up, but sometimes they seek resolutions in the wrong places.
I think in some ways this CISA is more insidious even than the Patriot Act, because as distasteful as it is to have the NSA, as outrageous as it is to have the NSA spying on you, this is worse because, in my opinion, because it turns private corporations and privately held businesses into intelligence agents for the government. And that seems that mixing of the public and private and turning your company you do business into a spy against you, it just seems so un-American.
Yeah, and the one percenter argument actually exists, because easy money helps the big bankers and all. So this is true, that it supports a smaller number of people, and I just think it's, unbelievably atrocious on how they do this.
Yeah, you can't have a private relationship with a business because that business is spying on you.
I think it's not a stretch to say this is a very significant move, as so many other moves have been made, moving toward a fascist government. To be polite, you call it corporatism and welfare for the rich and these things. But when you keep getting closer and closer, now there was and one of the reasons why I suspect this, I don't know if it's true, is that a lot of these companies, Facebook and others, were strongly opposed to this. And then there was maneuvering and manipulation. All of a sudden, they supported it more so behind the scenes than we realized. But one thing they always ask for, and when governments and big business deal with each other, whether it's in the medical or whatever, they release them from liability. Because, in a private in the private sector, in a free country, if you give me your personal information, I just can't give it to anybody. That's a liability. But here, giving away this information to the government, all of a sudden it becomes legal. That's their sense of morality.
There have been a couple of articles that we've read that have compared this to the process of the Patriot Act. And I think that's an apt description, because the Patriot Act, as everyone knows, I think, was kicked around Washington for a number of years until 9/11. CISA was the same. It had been kicked around Congress after Congress, too radical to pass. They thought they had something a couple of years ago, and then the Snowden revelations hit, and people realized, and they were outraged. Unfortunately, the outrage was tempered after a while, and you had the losing of this outrage, the mellowing of the outrage, and then you had these high-profile terrorist attacks that the media hyped up to the 10th degree, and in that exact atmosphere that mirrors 9/11, they push it through.
And I think there's a change in there that makes it easier to access. Before the threat had to be imminent, but now it just has to be suggested that there could be one. So it's easier to access. But up until now, which wasn't a good idea, but Homeland Security would get the information and say, no, it's going to be easier now to take this information that the private corporations have and give it directly to law enforcement agencies. They might realize that there's a bureaucracy there and it doesn't work. But do you have any other thoughts on why they might have changed that? Because why would that be necessary other than maybe the bureaucracy?
It's a good question. I think Homeland Security from what I've read, was slightly reticent about this massive collection because they thought it might clog the works a little bit, you know. But think about this: if you have if say you're living in some town, you're on Facebook, there's a local law enforcement, and say they're not corrupt, but they're not polite or something, they've done something that you don't like, and you post on Facebook the local cops are bad guys or something, you know, you could really open yourself up to a lot of problems, you know, with this information.
You know, one of the other things that was said about why it goes through this way, and the way we saw so many other ones go through, is on the important stuff you don't want to debate.
Yeah.
You know, I remember way back, and it had to do with the Monetary Control Act back in the early 80s when they were setting the stage for this big boom cycle. And in the, no, it wasn't even a manager's amendment. It's also when the bill goes to conference is another example of how they do this. Mm-hmm. House passes something, Senate passes something, then you go to a conference, and all of a sudden, that's supposed to bring things together. If you have a billion versus 500 million, you compromise and put it together. That's what the purpose of the conference is. But many times what they do is they put these two bills together and they add things on that they never voted on. And this was one of the things they did with the Monetary Control Act that opened up the door for exactly what the Fed did, you know, recently with the bailouts. They gave them more leeway and more authority to do exactly what they did. But they do this in the pretense, of course, taking care of the consumer, but they don't. They take care of the big guys.
And I think there was something in this version of CISA too, because from what I read, it was worse than the Senate version that had passed a few months ago. So
right, they tend to do that, and there's no surprise at that. I do want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. This is just another example of how important it is for us to maintain vigilance over what our government's doing, not only in what they say, but more importantly on what they don't say and what they do behind the scenes, and how the major leadership of both parties collude together. It's a pretense that there's a big difference. I mean, whether it's foreign policy or monetary policy or debt, it's all the same. Whether it's your privacy, they get together and no word. They want to do it in secret and they get away with it. And when the people do know, when they know what's really going on in foreign policy, they vote for peace. When they want to look at what the Fed's doing, they vote for audit and restraint on the Federal Reserve. But because the propaganda machine, which involves not only the politicians, but all the individuals in the media, they get together and they spew it out, and the people crumble and say, I am scared, they're going to come and get me, so therefore we have to give up our liberties for the sake of our safety and security. A very dangerous concept. It's gotten much worse, and someday we have to wake the American people up as to what a free country would be all about, because if you truly want security and happiness and prosperity, the only society that throughout history has provided the maximum amount of security is the one that we call the free market and individual liberty. We had a taste of it, but unfortunately we're drifting in the wrong direction politically. But in absolute thoughts on ideas, ideologically, I still believe that we're moving in the right direction. There's a rumble out there where people are saying too much government. I just hope they would do the right thing instead of turning to more government when they realize that government is at fault. When we realize that government is really the culprit, what we have to do is move away from that and defend the principles of individual liberty. That is the only way we can achieve peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.